The kitchen was warm that morning, filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the faint crackling of bacon in the pan. Sunlight filtered through the window, casting a golden hue across the countertop where she worked. Her delicate hands carefully flipped the eggs, a small smile forming on her lips as she imagined how their day might go. They had been together for years, and though things had seemed off lately, she believed this breakfast could remind him of the simple comforts of home. With the tray prepared, she carried it into the living room, where he sat slouched on the couch, his phone glowing in his hands. His eyes were glued to the screen, scrolling through messages with a concentration she hadn't seen in a long time, not directed at her at least. She placed the tray on the coffee table, waiting for him to look up. But he didn't. Instead, he muttered a soft, "Thanks," without lifting his gaze, as if her presence were nothing more than background noise. Her heart sank a little, but she pushed the feeling down. Maybe he was stressed with work. Maybe he didn't realize how distant he'd become. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked, settling next to him. She tried to make her voice light, as though the tension in her chest wasn't real. "Yeah, fine," he replied, still not looking up. His fingers tapped rapidly on the screen, and the faint sound of a notification buzzed. She caught a glimpse of the screen. A name she didn't recognize flashed before he quickly swiped it away. Her stomach tightened, but she didn't ask. Not yet. Silence hung between them, heavy and awkward. The warmth she had felt while cooking had faded, replaced by the cold realization that something was wrong. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Her question lingered in the air, unanswered for a moment too long. "I'm just busy," he finally said, his voice dismissive. He stood, grabbing his coat and keys. "I've got a meeting. Don't wait up for me tonight." Her throat tightened, but she forced a nod. The door clicked shut behind him, and she sat there, staring at the untouched plate of food. The same food she had made to remind them of the life they built together, now sitting cold and forgotten. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of the couch as she wondered how long it had been since they'd had a proper conversation, one where he wasn't rushing off or glued to his phone. The feeling gnawed at her throughout the day. She tried to distract herself by cleaning, organising the bookshelf, and watering the plants, but her thoughts always circled back to that message on his phone. Who was she? Why had he hidden it so quickly? That evening, she sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on as the sky darkened. Her phone lay beside her, silent and empty. He hadn't called or texted all day. She sipped her tea, the warmth doing little to ease the ache in her chest. The clock ticked past 10 p.m, then 11. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her blanket, her eyes darting between the door and her phone. At midnight, the sound of the front door unlocking snapped her from her trance. He stepped inside, smelling faintly of perfume, one that wasn't hers. His hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a carelessness in the way he kicked off his shoes, as though he didn't care who saw him walk through that door. For the first time, she didn't greet him. She didn't ask how his day was or why he was late. She just sat there, gripping her cup tightly, as the reality of her suspicion solidified. He paused, sensing the weight of her silence. But he didn't say anything either. He disappeared into the bedroom, shutting the door behind him. She stayed in the living room, her mind racing. It wasn't just work, and it wasn't just her imagination. Something had shifted between them, and she could feel it slipping further away with each passing day. As the night deepened, she stared at the ceiling, wondering how much longer she could pretend this wasn't happening. The next morning felt colder, even though the sun was shining brightly outside. She woke up to the empty side of the bed, the sheets wrinkled but cool to the touch. He had already left, no goodbye kiss, no note, just the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the air. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric of her nightgown as she tried to collect her thoughts. Last night's silence had been deafening, and the ache in her heart had only deepened. She moved through her morning routine like a ghost, brushing her hair in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection as if looking for an answer she couldn't find. Her eyes, once full of warmth and hope, looked tired and distant. With a heavy sigh, she pulled on a simple sweater and jeans, grabbed her bag, and headed out for some fresh air. The city buzzed around her as she walked aimlessly through the streets, her thoughts a chaotic mess. Was she being paranoid? Overreacting? Or was her gut trying to tell her something she didn't want to admit? As much as she tried to dismiss it, the doubt had taken root, and it wouldn't let her go. She found herself in a small park, the sound of children laughing and birds chirping filling the air. She sat on a bench, watching as life continued around her, unaffected by her turmoil. Her phone buzzed in her bag, jolting her from her thoughts. For a split second, her heart leapt, hoping it was him. But as she pulled it out, her stomach dropped. It wasn't him. It was her best friend, calling to check in. She debated ignoring it, but the weight of her emotions made her answer. "Hey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You okay?" "You sound off," her friend said, concern evident in her tone. She wanted to say she was fine, that it was nothing, but the words felt like lies, and she was too tired to pretend. "I think something's wrong," she confessed, her voice cracking slightly. "He's distant, he comes home late, and there's someone else. At least, I think there is." Her friend didn't hesitate. "You need to talk to him. Don't sit and suffer in silence. If there's something going on, you deserve to know." She nodded, even though her friend couldn't see her. "You're right. I'll talk to him tonight." The conversation ended, but the knot in her chest only grew tighter. The idea of confronting him terrified her. What if he admitted there was someone else? What if everything she feared was true? She tried to shake off the thought, but it clung to her like a shadow. By the time she returned home, the sky had turned a soft orange, the sun dipping below the horizon. She placed her keys on the kitchen counter and noticed the silence of the apartment, the same silence that had become her constant companion. She went to the bedroom, tidying up the mess from the morning when her fingers brushed against the pocket of his jacket hanging on the chair. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath quickening as she hesitated. "Don't do it," she told herself, but her hands didn't listen. She reached inside the pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, one that wasn't hers. It was delicate, embroidered with a floral design, and carried a faint scent of perfume. Her fingers trembled as she held it, her mind racing. Then, as if fate wanted to punish her further, she felt the vibration of his phone nearby on the dresser. A notification lit up the screen, showing a text from an unfamiliar number. "Last night was perfect. Can't wait to see you again." Her world stopped. The room felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of what she'd just discovered. Her knees buckled, and she sat on the bed, staring at the phone as tears welled in her eyes. There was no denying it now. The truth had been laid bare, and it hurt more than she ever imagined. She sat there for what felt like hours, tears silently streaming down her face as she clutched the handkerchief. The man she had given everything to, the man she trusted with her heart, had betrayed her. And now, she had to face the reality of it all. When she finally wiped her tears and stood, she wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the fact that she still loved him despite it. But one thing was certain. Tonight, the silence would end. That evening, the apartment felt colder than usual, as though the warmth they had once shared had evaporated entirely. She stood by the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the dim streetlights flickering in the distance. Her hands gripped the counter as she rehearsed what she would say, but every scenario ended the same, with her heart breaking all over again. She heard the sound of keys jingling outside the door, followed by the familiar creak of it opening. Her breath hitched. He walked in, looking tired and distant, the way he had for weeks now. He didn't greet her, didn't even glance in her direction. Instead, he kicked off his shoes and tossed his keys onto the table before heading toward the bedroom. She didn't move. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists, forcing herself to stay strong. This was it. No more hiding, no more waiting for things to magically fix themselves. She followed him into the bedroom, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. He was removing his watch and placing it on the nightstand when she spoke, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "We need to talk." He paused for a moment but didn't turn around. "Can it wait? I'm exhausted." "No," she said firmly. "It can't." He sighed and finally turned to face her, his expression indifferent. "What is it?" For a moment she couldn't find the words. The weight of everything she had held in, the sleepless nights, the tears she cried in secret, the doubt that had eaten away at her, pushed against her chest, threatening to suffocate her. But then she saw the handkerchief on the nightstand, the same one she'd found in his pocket earlier, the same one that smelled like another woman. Her gaze locked on it, and just like that, the dam broke. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. His eyes followed hers to the handkerchief, and for a split second, his expression faltered. It was brief, but it was enough. She saw the guilt, the panic, and then the mask of indifference slipped back into place. "You're overthinking things," he said, his tone dismissive. "There's no one." "Don't lie to me," she whispered, her throat tightening. She took a step closer, holding up his phone, the message from earlier still glowing on the screen. "I saw this. I saw the handkerchief. I'm not stupid." His jaw tightened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to finally be spoken. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "It's nothing. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Her chest ached as his words stabbed into her, each one dismissing the pain she felt. "Nothing," she repeated, her voice breaking. "Staying out late, coming home smelling like someone else, hiding messages on your phone. How is that nothing? I've been here, holding on, hoping you'd talk to me, hoping we could fix this, but you've already replaced me, haven't you?" He looked away, his silence louder than any confession. She felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stay upright. She wouldn't let him see her fall apart. Not yet. "Say something," she begged. "Tell me the truth." He finally met her gaze, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, maybe even shame, but it wasn't enough. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said quietly. "It just did." Her breath hitched, the final confirmation shattering the last piece of hope she had been clinging to. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, raw and unfiltered, because she needed him to see what he had done to her. "I gave you everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I loved you, trusted you, and this is what I get." He opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't want to hear it. Whatever excuse he had wouldn't matter. The damage was already done. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the bedroom, her mind spinning. She needed to think, to breathe, to get away from the suffocating weight of his betrayal. As she reached the door, she heard him call her name, but she didn't stop. Her hand gripped the doorknob, and for a moment she hesitated, wondering if there was anything left to salvage. But then she remembered the handkerchief, the messages and the lies. There was nothing left. She opened the door and stepped into the cool night air, the sound of it shutting behind her echoing like the final chapter of a story that had ended long before she was ready to let it go. The night air bit against her skin as she walked aimlessly down the dimly lit street, her breath forming small clouds of fog in the cold. Her tears blurred the glow of the streetlights, but she didn't stop walking. She didn't know where she was going, and right now she didn't care. Her mind was a storm of memories. The laughter they used to share, the promises he made, the dreams they had built together. How had it all unraveled so quickly? Had she been blind to the signs? Or had he been that good at hiding the truth? She found herself at a small park, the same park where they used to sit on lazy afternoons, sharing ice cream and talking about their future. Her legs finally gave out, and she sank onto a bench, burying her face in her hands. She sobbed quietly, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She'd spent years building her life around him, and in just a few weeks, it had all come crumbling down. The wind rustled through the trees, and she sat there, lost in her thoughts, until her sobs subsided into soft sniffles. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater and leaned back, staring at the starless sky. Her mind raced through her options: confront him again, demand an apology, or walk away for good. But the thought that gnawed at her most was whether she could survive without him. Despite everything, she still loved him. The thought made her feel weak, pathetic even, but it was the truth. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and for a moment she considered ignoring it. But when she pulled it out and saw her best friend's name on the screen, she answered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Are you okay?" her friend asked, the concern in her voice almost too much to bear. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I confronted him. He didn't even try to deny it." There was a pause on the other end, and then her friend sighed. "I'm so sorry. You don't deserve this." The words made her tears well up again. "I don't know what to do. I feel so lost." "You don't have to decide anything right now," her friend said gently. "Just take it one step at a time. You don't owe him forgiveness or another chance. But if you need to leave, you know you're not alone." She nodded, even though her friend couldn't see her. "Thank you," she whispered. After the call ended, she sat on the bench for a while longer, the silence around her slowly easing the chaos in her mind. Her fingers brushed against her stomach absent-mindedly, a habit she hadn't thought much of before. But tonight, the touch felt different, as if her body was trying to tell her something. A wave of nausea hit her suddenly, and she doubled over, gripping the edge of the bench as she tried to steady her breathing. When it finally passed, she sat up, her heart racing. It wasn't the first time she had felt sick recently, but she had chalked it up to stress. Now, as she thought about it, the dizziness, the exhaustion, the sudden cravings, they all pointed to something else. Her breath hitched as the possibility hit her like a tidal wave. Could she be pregnant? The thought sent a chill down her spine, not because she feared motherhood, but because of what it meant. A baby, his baby, would tie her to him forever, whether she wanted it or not. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone and searched for the nearest pharmacy. She had to know, and she had to know now. The short walk to the pharmacy felt like an eternity. Her thoughts spiraled, flipping between fear and hope, between heartbreak and the possibility of something new. When she finally reached the counter, she grabbed the pregnancy test with shaky hands, avoiding the cashier's gaze as she paid. Her fingers gripped the small paper bag tightly as she hurried home, her heart pounding louder with every step. Back in her apartment, the silence felt heavier than ever. She dropped her bag on the floor and headed straight to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her, pale and tear-streaked, but her focus wasn't on that. She ripped open the test, her hands shaking as she followed the instructions. The waiting felt like a lifetime. She sat on the bathroom floor, her knees pulled to her chest, silently praying for clarity. Whether she wanted a positive or negative result, she wasn't sure. But when the result appeared, her breath caught in her throat. 2 lines. Positive. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face once more. She wasn't sure whether they were tears of joy, fear, or heartbreak. Maybe it was all of them at once. The truth was undeniable now. She was carrying his child. And suddenly, her decision wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the life growing inside her, a life that hadn't asked to be part of this chaos. She clutched the test in her hand, her mind racing. What would she do now? The room felt like it was spinning as she sat on the bathroom floor, gripping the positive pregnancy test. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her chest. She pressed her hand against her stomach, the realization that a tiny life was growing inside her, flooding her with a mixture of emotions she couldn't fully process. She wanted to cry, to scream, to feel joy, to feel fear. All of it collided inside her, leaving her frozen in place. After what felt like hours, she finally stood up, her legs weak beneath her. She placed the test on the counter and splashed cold water on her face, hoping it would help her think clearly. But the only thought that kept echoing in her mind was, "What do I do now?" She walked out of the bathroom, leaving the light on behind her, as if she couldn't bear the idea of darkness right now. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she stared at the crumpled sheets and replayed the confrontation from earlier in her mind. His lies, his dismissive tone, the way he had refused to meet her gaze, it all played like a broken record, only this time the stakes felt higher. She placed her hand on her stomach again, the gesture instinctive, protective. The life inside her deserved more than a broken relationship built on betrayal. But did that mean she had to walk away for good? Or should she give him a chance to be part of this child's life? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. She froze, her heart racing. She had forgotten to lock it in her rush earlier. Footsteps echoed softly down the hallway, and her breath hitched as he appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, his face etched with exhaustion and something else. Maybe guilt, maybe regret. She couldn't tell anymore. "I thought you'd be gone," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of relief and hesitation. "I almost was," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But then I found out something that stopped me." He took a step closer, confusion clouding his expression. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening over the edge of the bed. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. His eyes widened, and for the first time that night, he seemed genuinely speechless. She watched as the colour drained from his face, his jaw clenching and unclenching as he struggled to find the right response. The silence stretched on, suffocating her. "You're sure?" he finally managed to say, his voice shaky. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I took the test tonight. I didn't plan for this, I didn't expect it, but it's real." He sat down on the edge of the bed, running his hands through his hair as he stared at the floor. "I don't know what to say," he muttered almost to himself. She felt the sting of his words, even though she had prepared herself for them. "I don't know what to say." That was all he could manage after everything? After shattering her trust, after making her feel like she wasn't enough, now he didn't know what to say about the baby they had created together. "I didn't tell you to hear that," she said, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I told you because you deserve to know, and because I need to make a decision, not just for me, but for this baby. And I can't do that while I'm drowning in the lies you've buried me under." He lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that night. There was something raw in his gaze, something she hadn't seen in a long time. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he whispered. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" She cut him off, her voice rising. "You don't get to call it that. A mistake is forgetting a date or saying the wrong thing in an argument. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, and you kept making that choice over and over. He flinched as if her words had physically hit him, but she didn't care. He needed to feel what she felt, even if only for a moment. The pain, the betrayal, the loneliness. It all poured out of her like a flood. Years of love and trust washed away by the storm of what he had done. I stayed up nights, wondering if I wasn't enough for you, she continued, her voice shaking. I blamed myself for the distance between us. I tried to fix it, but you were already gone, weren't you? I wasn't gone, he said quickly, his voice desperate now. I was stupid, selfish, but I never stopped loving you. She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. You don't get to say that after everything you did. Silence fell between them again, thick and suffocating. He lowered his head, his shoulders trembling slightly. She had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so broken, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage he had caused. Her heart ached, but she knew she couldn't let herself be swayed by the emotion in his eyes. She had to think about what was best for her and her baby. I need time, she whispered, wiping her tears. Time to figure out what I want and what this baby needs. And right now, that means being away from you. He looked up, panic flashing across his face. Please, don't leave. I'll do anything. She stood, cutting him off. If you really mean that, then prove it, not with words, but with actions. Maybe then, someday, we can talk about forgiveness. But not now. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the bedroom. Her tears blurred her vision, but she didn't stop. She grabbed her bag, pulled on her coat, and stepped outside into the cool night air once more. As she closed the door behind her, she heard him call her name, but she didn't turn back. Her heart was heavy, but her mind was made up. She had a life to protect now, and she couldn't let herself be trapped in a cycle of betrayal. As painful as it was, walking away was the first step toward healing. The morning sunlight broke through the blinds of the small motel room she had checked into the night before. The pale light painted the room in soft gold, but it did little to warm the chill in her heart. She sat on the bed, her legs tucked beneath her, the pregnancy test still clutched in her hand. She hadn't been able to sleep, not with the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the shock, the regret, the desperation. She wanted to forget it, but her mind wouldn't let her. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, breaking the stillness of the room. She didn't need to check it to know who it was. He had been calling and texting non-stop since she walked out, leaving messages that ranged from apologies to pleas for her to come back. She stared at the screen as his name flashed once again, her fingers hovering over the decline button before she finally let the call go unanswered. She couldn't face him right now. Not yet. With a deep breath, she stood and walked to the small bathroom, splashing cold water on her face. The water dripped from her chin, and she wiped it away with a towel, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her skin looked pale, almost fragile. But beneath that fragile surface was a strength she hadn't fully recognized until last night. She had survived his betrayal, and she would survive this too. She packed her bag, her mind already forming a plan. She couldn't hide in a motel forever. She needed stability, a place where she could feel safe and think clearly. Her fingers brushed over her phone as she scrolled through her contacts, hesitating before finally pressing the call button. "Hello?" Her best friend's voice answered, warm and familiar. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I need a place to stay." Without hesitation, her friend replied, "Come over. Stay as long as you need." Relief flooded her chest, and she felt a fresh wave of tears building. But this time, they weren't from heartbreak. They were from the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone. "Thank you," she whispered. The cab ride to her friend's apartment was quiet, giving her time to think. The city moved around her in its usual chaotic rhythm, but she felt disconnected from it, as if she were watching it through a foggy lens. She rested her hand on her stomach, a protective gesture she had started to do unconsciously. The baby wasn't just a responsibility, it was her reason to keep going. When she arrived, her friend greeted her with a warm hug, pulling her inside the cozy apartment. The familiar scent of vanilla candles and freshly brewed coffee immediately eased some of the tension in her shoulders. "Sit down," her friend said, guiding her to the couch. "I'll make you something to eat." She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the smell of scrambled eggs and toast wafted through the air. As she ate, she told her friend everything. The messages she found, the confrontation, the pregnancy, and the overwhelming fear of what came next. Her voice wavered at times, but her friend didn't interrupt. She listened patiently, nodding at the right moments and offering a comforting hand on hers when the tears became too much to hold back. When she finally finished, her plate empty and her throat raw from crying, her friend let out a soft sigh. "You've been through hell," she said gently, squeezing her hand, "but you're stronger than you think. You left, you made the right decision, and now you're protecting yourself and your baby. That takes courage." She sniffled, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I don't feel strong. I feel broken and scared." "That's normal," her friend reassured her, "but you won't feel like this forever. You have time to figure things out, and you don't have to do it alone." Her friend's words wrapped around her like a blanket of warmth, but there was still a nagging thought that wouldn't leave her mind. What if she couldn't do this? What if raising a baby alone was too much? She had imagined building a family with him, not like this, not as a single mother with a broken heart. Her friend seemed to sense her spiraling thoughts and leaned forward, her expression soft but serious. "Do you still love him?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth, but the answer wasn't simple. Did she still love him? Yes, she did. Even after everything, the love hadn't disappeared. It was buried beneath layers of pain, but it was still there, flickering like a dying flame. But could love be enough to forgive what he had done? "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if love is enough anymore." Her friend nodded, as if she understood exactly what she meant. "That's okay. You don't have to decide today. Take your time. But remember, forgiving him doesn't mean you have to let him back into your life. You can forgive for your own peace and still move on." The idea of forgiveness felt foreign and impossible right now, but she appreciated the advice. For now, she just needed space. Space to think, to heal, and to focus on her baby. She spent the rest of the day curled up on the couch, watching mindless TV shows while her friend occasionally checked on her. The quiet comfort of being in a safe place helped ease some of her anxiety, but she knew the hardest decisions were still ahead. That evening, as she lay in bed in her friend's spare room, her phone buzzed again. She sighed, assuming it was another message from him, but when she picked it up, her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a text, it was a voicemail. Her thumb hovered over the play button before she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Finally, she pressed play. His voice came through, shaky and raw, as if he had been crying. "I know you don't want to hear from me, but please, just listen. I'm sorry for everything, for lying, for hurting you, for being the man you didn't deserve. I know I messed up and I can't change the past, but I want to be there for you and our baby. I don't expect you to forgive me and I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you, Please give me a chance to prove I can be better. I'll do anything." Her fingers trembled as she listened to the message, tears slipping down her cheeks once again. His voice sounded genuine, filled with pain and regret, but she couldn't trust her heart to make the decision right now. She needed clarity, not more confusion. She deleted the message without replying and placed the phone on the nightstand. The tears came again, but this time they weren't as overwhelming. As she curled into the blanket, her hand resting on her stomach, she whispered softly to herself, "It's not just about him anymore. It's about what's best for us." With that thought, she closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new decisions and that she would face them, one step at a time. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the room, casting a soft glow across the walls. She stretched, her body feeling slightly less heavy than the night before. For the first time in days, she had managed to get some sleep. But the weight of her reality quickly returned as she sat up, her fingers instinctively brushing over her stomach. The life growing inside her reminded her that her choices weren't just about her anymore. She walked into the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Her friend greeted her with a warm smile, setting a mug on the table. "Morning. Did you sleep okay?" "Better than I expected," she admitted, taking a sip of the warm liquid. The rich taste was comforting, grounding her in the moment. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before her friend finally spoke. "So, what's the plan? What do you want to do?" She sighed, setting the mug down and tracing the rim with her finger. "I don't know. I listened to his voicemail last night. He sounded broken. He said he wants to be part of the baby's life and that he's willing to do anything to prove he's changed." Her friend leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you believe him?" That was the question she had been asking herself over and over. Did she believe that he could change, that he truly regretted what he had done? Part of her wanted to believe it, to cling to the possibility that the man she had fallen in love with was still there, buried beneath his mistakes. But the other part of her, the one still nursing a wounded heart, couldn't forget the lies, the betrayal, and the night spent wondering where he was. "I don't know," she admitted. "He sounded sincere, but words are easy. It's his actions I don't trust." Her friend nodded in agreement. "You're right. Words mean nothing without action. But you don't have to make any decisions today. Give yourself time to see what he's willing to do. If he's serious, he'll prove it." That thought stayed with her as the day passed. She spent most of it in her friend's apartment, going back and forth between moments of calm and moments of emotional chaos. By the afternoon, she decided she needed fresh air, so she grabbed her coat and headed to the nearby park. The crisp air stung her cheeks, but it was a welcome distraction from the whirlwind inside her. As she walked along the winding paths, her mind drifted to memories of him, how he used to make her laugh until her sides hurt, how they would stay up late talking about their dreams, how he had once been the man she trusted more than anyone. She hated that those memories still had the power to make her heart ache, but she couldn't ignore them, just like she couldn't ignore the reality of who he had become. She sat on a bench overlooking a small pond, watching ducks glide across the water. Children's laughter echoed nearby, and for a moment she imagined herself there a few months from now, pushing a stroller with her baby bundled up against the cold. The thought made her smile softly, but it also reminded her of the uncertainty ahead. Would she be doing this alone, or would he be by her side? As if the universe had heard her thoughts, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She hesitated before pulling it out, expecting another message from him. But this time, it was a text from her doctor's office, confirming her appointment for the following week. She hadn't thought much about the appointment until now, but it hit her that it would be the first official step in her journey as a mother. Her fingers hovered over her phone, debating whether to tell him. He had the right to know, didn't he? She let out a shaky breath and opened a new message. "Doctor's appointment next week. I thought you should know." She stared at the words for a moment before hitting send. Almost instantly, the reply came through. "I'll be there. Thank you for letting me know." Simple, but it carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She tucked the phone back into her pocket and leaned back against the bench, closing her eyes for a moment. This wasn't going to be easy. She still didn't know if she could forgive him, if she could ever trust him again. But for now, she would take things one step at a time. If he truly wanted to be there, he would prove it. And if he didn't, she would be ready to walk this path alone. As she stood up and continued her walk, she realized that the fear she had felt before wasn't as overwhelming anymore. She had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, she felt like she had the strength to face whatever came next. The week leading up to the doctor's appointment passed slowly, each day a mix of anxiety and quiet anticipation. She kept herself busy helping her friend around the apartment, occasionally browsing through baby articles on her phone. But no matter what she did, the thought of seeing him at the appointment loomed over her. Would he actually show up? Or would his promise be another empty one, like the ones he had given her in the past? The night before the appointment, sleep was nearly impossible. She tossed and turned, her mind filled with questions. What if seeing him reopened wounds she wasn't ready to face? What if he acted like the man she fell in love with, making her question whether she had been too quick to leave? Or worse, what if he showed up and she saw nothing but the man who had betrayed her? When morning finally arrived, she got ready in silence, her nerves making her stomach twist. Her friend offered to drive her, but she declined, wanting to face this part of her journey on her own. She left the apartment, bundled in a thick coat, her hand resting on her stomach for comfort as she walked to the bus stop. The waiting room at the clinic was warm, the soft hum of conversation around her, blending with the distant sound of a TV playing morning news. She sat in one of the chairs, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. She glanced at the clock on the wall, her heart pounding as each second ticked by. He still wasn't here. Don't expect anything, she told herself. You've been disappointed enough. But even as she thought it, a part of her couldn't help but hope. Just as she was about to give up, the glass door at the entrance slid open, and there he was. Her breath hitched as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until they found hers. He looked different, tired, worn, but there was something else in his expression, something she hadn't seen in a long time. Determination. He walked over slowly, as if unsure whether she wanted him there. "Hi," he said softly, his voice tentative. "Hi," she replied, her tone guarded. He sat down next to her, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a moment, they sat in silence, neither of them knowing what to say. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Thank you for telling me about this. I wasn't sure if you would." She glanced at him, her fingers still nervously playing with the strap of her bag. "I wasn't sure either, but I figured you deserved to know." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I do, and I'm here. Whatever you need, I'm here." Before she could respond, a nurse called her name and she stood up, clutching her bag tightly. She wasn't sure whether to invite him in, but when she glanced back at him, the hopeful look in his eyes made her pause. "You can come," she said quietly, and he followed her into the room. The ultrasound room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the machine filling the space. She lay back on the examination table, her heart pounding as the technician spread the cool gel over her stomach. He stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. And then, The sound filled the room, the steady, rapid heartbeat of their baby. Her breath caught, tears welling in her eyes as she listened to the sound of life, pure and real. She turned her head slightly and saw him staring at the screen, his eyes wide with wonder. His hand instinctively reached for hers, and for a moment she let him hold it. His grip was firm, as if he were silently promising to hold on and not let go this time. "That's our baby," he whispered, his voice cracking. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yeah, that's our baby." The technician smiled, printing out the ultrasound image before handing it to her. She held it in her hands, her eyes tracing the tiny form on the screen. Beside her, he wiped his face, trying to compose himself, but she could see the raw emotion he was struggling to contain. When the appointment ended, they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the sun shining brightly despite the chill. They stood by the entrance, neither of them ready to leave just yet. She clutched the ultrasound image, the weight of what had just happened settling over her like a blanket. "I'm sorry for everything," he said suddenly, his voice filled with more sincerity than she had heard before. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but seeing this baby, it's made me realize how much I want to be part of their life. I want to do this right. Even if we can't fix us, please let me be there for them." Her throat tightened, the words hitting her harder than she expected. For so long, she had imagined this moment, but now that it was here, she didn't know what to do. Could she trust him again? Could she let him into her life without risking her heart? "I don't know what the future holds," she said honestly, her voice soft. "But if you're serious, you'll prove it. Not with promises, but with time. And if you do, then maybe we can figure out how to do this together." He nodded, a small glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. "I'll prove it. I promise." She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The decision wasn't final, but it was a start, a fragile step towards something new. She tucked the ultrasound image into her bag and began walking down the street. He didn't follow, but she knew he was watching, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. The following weeks unfolded slowly, each day a delicate balance between hope and caution. True to his word, he made an effort to prove himself. He texted her each morning, asking how she was feeling. He showed up to every prenatal appointment without fail, sometimes bringing small gifts. Prenatal vitamins, a warm scarf for the chilly weather, or a container of her favourite soup. But he never overstepped. He stayed respectful of the distance she had created, as if he knew that one misstep could shatter the fragile progress they had made. She couldn't deny that seeing him show up every day chipped away at the wall she had built around her heart. Slowly, the memories of betrayal were being replaced by new ones. Him sitting next to her in waiting rooms, nervously bouncing his knee as they waited for the doctor. Him holding her hand during blood tests, whispering, "You've got this." And the quiet moments when he would leave handwritten notes of encouragement in her bag. But no matter how much he tried, the hurt hadn't completely healed. Some nights, she still woke up with tears in her eyes, the weight of the past pressing down on her. She was scared of trusting him again, scared of being vulnerable only to have her heart shattered once more. When she stared at the ultrasound image pinned to her wall, she reminded herself that her focus had to be on the baby, not the man who had broken her. One evening, after a long day at work, she returned to her friend's apartment to find a familiar figure waiting at the doorstep. He was holding a small bouquet of sunflowers, her favourite. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hated that it still reacted this way, even after everything. He offered a nervous smile as he held the flowers out to her. "For you," he said softly. She hesitated, her fingers grazing the petals before taking them. "Thanks," she mumbled, unlocking the door and stepping inside. He followed, standing awkwardly in the entryway as she placed the flowers in a vase on the kitchen counter. "I was wondering if you'd let me take you out for dinner," he said, his voice tentative. "Nothing fancy, just a chance to talk." She turned to face him, her arms crossed. "What's there to talk about?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Everything. I know we've been doing this co-parenting thing, and I'm grateful for that. But I also know I hurt you, and if there's any chance of fixing what we had, I need you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Her chest tightened, and she looked away, focusing on the vase of flowers. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I know," he said, taking a cautious step closer. "And I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I'm asking for a chance to earn it. I've changed, but I don't expect you to believe that until you see it for yourself." Silence hung between them, thick with unspoken emotions. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that people could change, that love could survive even after being shattered. But a part of her still held back, afraid of getting hurt again. Finally, she exhaled and met his gaze. "Dinner. Just dinner. And we'll see where it goes." He smiled, relief washing over his face. "That's all I'm asking." The restaurant he picked was small and cozy, tucked away on a quiet street. The warm lighting and the soft murmur of conversation created an intimate atmosphere, but she kept her guard up. They sat across from each other, the table between them both a physical and emotional barrier. At first, the conversation was stiff and polite. Small talk about her work, the baby, and how she had been feeling. But as the evening went on, the tension began to ease. He asked about her dreams, her plans for the future, and whether she had thought about baby names. For the first time in a long while, she felt like they were connecting, not as a couple, but as two people who shared something precious. As they left the restaurant, the cool night air wrapped around them. They walked slowly, neither in a hurry to say goodbye. The street was quiet, the distant sound of a car passing by the only noise. She stopped at the corner of the street, turning to face him. "I'm still scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can forget what you did." He took a step closer, his eyes soft and full of remorse. "I don't want you to forget. I want to be the reason you believe that we can move forward. I'm not asking for everything right away. I just want a chance to show you that I'm not the same man who hurt you." Her throat tightened, tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. "This isn't going to be easy." "I know," he said, gently taking her hand, "but you're worth it. Our baby is worth it." She looked down at their hands, his warmth comforting against the cold night. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But she wasn't ready to jump back into their old life. Not yet. "Take it slow," she whispered, "one step at a time." He nodded, his grip on her hand tightening slightly, as if promising not to let go. One step at a time. And as they stood there beneath the glow of the streetlights, she realized that while the path ahead was uncertain, she wasn't walking it alone anymore.